Anyway, thanks for joining us. We watched the video where you're partly sort of undercover in this New York hospital and partly an interview. And it's an hour and a half or so of just really fascinating and bizarre information. You went from Florida to New York City to help out during the pandemic, right? Around the peak.
Correct.
Or just shortly thereafter. And you found some really strange occurrences going on there. Things like PPEs not even being worn properly. How is that possible with medical professionals like this?
Well, what happened is it became a liability-free environment, during this pandemic. So everything that, doctors and nurses had ever been taught kind of got, tossed out the window. And that's really sad because most people in there should have held their integrity and done the right thing, even if they weren't going to be liable if something happened. But nobody played by those rules. And that's really what set everything up for failure.
You noticed that right away, I think, pretty close to the very beginning, that they were mixing non-COVID patients with COVID patients. Why would they do that? Is there a logical explanation for that?
No. I mean, I've thought about it. Like, that's one of the things that really surprised me when I got there, is seeing all of these, non-COVID rule-out patients who were waiting tests on the same floors with these positive, that we knew confirmed positive patients. And there's only, and I don't understand it. I really don't understand it. There would be patients that would have multiple negative tests and they were still diagnosed as COVID positive. So There was a lot of just reckless behavior.
And is that because they get more money from the federal government if they're treating COVID patients?
In my opinion, I think it didn't hurt to admit these patients, for a paycheck. And sadly, they essentially treated them as a dollar sign and disposable.
So, I mean, the inference here would be that they're trying to give COVID-19 to the patients who didn't have it to begin with, right? Isn't that what you would infer from that?
I would say that they weren't trying to avoid it.
Yeah.
Because if they were trying to avoid it, they could have utilized the comfort ship. They could have utilized the Javits Center, but instead they just packed them all into Elmhurst Hospital like sardines. And, any medical professional, you don't even need to be a medical professional to understand that what's going to happen when you do something like that.
You mentioned that there is a rapid COVID-19 test. It takes, 45 minutes, I think you said, in order to get the results. But they were doing tests that take 5 to 7 days for results. What did they tell you when you asked why they weren't using the rapid test?
They were too expensive. Yeah, that was it. I mean, that was one of the recorded conversations I had with a doctor while I was there. And I asked about that. I'm like, if you can avoid putting these patients that are COVID rule out onto these floors by giving them a rapid test while they're in the emergency room and sending them home to self-quarantine like they were doing here, why aren't you guys doing that? It makes absolutely no sense when we have something like that available and readily available. So it was too expensive for them to invest in something like that. So why not just admit them to the floor, take their paycheck, and, it's essentially an assembly line to a body bag. You go to the emergency room, you get admitted, you eventually you put on a vent, and then you end up outside in the truck.
Yeah, and I mean it's almost a death sentence, isn't it? Putting them on a ventilator. I heard just astronomical numbers that once you wind up on a ventilator, there's about an 89 or 90% chance of death. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the doctor I was speaking with there stated that there hadn't been one patient that had been put on a vent and successfully extubated. Every single one of the patients had died.
Oh my gosh!
That's at the time when I asked him. I think maybe their turnaround is they've probably saved 2%, and that was like in May, when.
Yeah. So like a 98% chance of death if you go on a ventilator. If you're a patient, can you say, hey, when you come in, don't put me on a ventilator. I don't care what happens. I don't want to be on a ventilator.
People have to have that. It's kind of like you can have a Dni order. It's called Do Not Intubate.
Okay.
That usually has to be done prior to even going into the emergency room. And most people obviously don't have that. And then what they were telling these patients is that either you're going to die of COVID or you're going to have to be put, you're going to have to be put on a ventilator essentially. So pick right now. And people are like, wow. Oh my gosh, am I supposed to pick death or am I supposed to go on this ventilator even though that's going to, and they won't tell you, we don't really have any successful, rate here. So you're going to end up actually dying either way.
Did they use things like hydroxychloroquine in combination with other drugs? Did they do any of that?
I know they were using it all the way up until March 23rd when Cuomo put out the executive order that banned it for any off-label use. And that's also another thing with that is, so everything was liability free except if a doctor prescribed hydroxychloroquine for COVID, then he could be liable and he would probably lose his license and be fired.
So they wouldn't want to risk it, I would imagine.
Correct.
Right. You had an amazing story on the video about a 37-year-old patient who went to the hospital and he didn't have COVID-19, but ended up dying from it anyway in the hospital. Tell us that story.
He was one of those that were forced to be on a ventilator. I didn't have him when he signed the paperwork, but I did have friends there that were there that took care of him. And he was pretty much coerced into signing this, being put on a ventilator, ended up having like multiple different just procedures while he was like, pretty much kept in a coma for over a month, which ultimately ended up killing him. His story is particularly interesting because he was a full code and his family wanted us to do absolutely everything. They made it very clear that they didn't want him to just be left to die. That's a do not resuscitate order. And what I captured on video with that is the doctors telling us nurses that we will not be providing life-sustaining measures if he tries to code. And that is, in my opinion, murder because they're going against the patient's wishes and the family's wishes.
Right.
And then they would still document it as we tried, but no success. I mean, that kind of stuff happened all the time.